Welcome to the Shropshire CCG board meeting. I'd like to welcome you to Ludlow. We've previously had a private board meeting which preceded this meeting, and the resolution on that is on the agenda. So we move into today's meeting. We've had 3 apologies with Mr. Keith Timmis sent his apologies and Dr. Steve James. But also today we also had apologies from Sarah Porter as well. So thank you. Hopefully today's paper will cover a few of the key issues with regards to our current finances and our performance, and also look at our update on the arrangements that we're doing with Telford and Wrekin CCG, and also talk about our strategic priorities and look at our integrated assurance framework results. But they will all come out through the meeting. First of all, if I can ask members for declarations of interest with regards to this meeting over and above those that are currently on the CCG website. So if we start down with Lynn and Mike and just go around the table, see if there's any other declarations of interest.
Do I have to mention that we're the primary care network?
If it's not already declared on the website, then I think yes. If you could do, then yes, that would be.
Market Drayton and Podnet primary care network, as well as everything else.
Okay, thank you.
No interest?
No.
Nothing additional.
Just what's on the register? Nothing additional.
Obviously, but my practice is in the Shrewsbury PCM, but I think that's on the website.
Nothing extra.
Not for me. No, thank you.
And my practice is also in the Shrewsbury PCM.
Nothing new from me, thank you.
My practice is in the South East PCA.
No conflicts to declare. Nothing for me.
Okay, thank you. And Rachel, no. So we move on to the minutes of the previous meeting. This was the meeting held on the 10th of July. So if we can check them first for accuracy and corrections. So if we deal through with pages 1 through till 10 initially.
Yeah, just 10.14 should not read quip, it should read help to quit rather than quip. 10.14, I think.
Thank you. I note that. And then if we move on from pages 11 through to the age page 13. Thank you. Otherwise, I'll accept those as a true and accurate record. And if we move on into the matters arising, most of these have been completed, but I'll run through them quickly. The first one was about adding something to add extra risks onto the GBAC, and that's been completed. Then there was an action for Claire Skidmore to look at some of the assumptions, and they were provided back in the report of the 7th of August Finance meeting. The third one was obviously to arrange for an annual review of the Learning Disabilities Mortality Review to be presented to the board, and that's on the agenda for today. And then there was an alteration for Dr Davis to make in the current report. Then there's an update around future strategic commissioning arrangements, but that also is on the agenda today. And then there's 2 actions around the ambulance demand. First one was about Dr Davis look at strengthening the way the CCG interface with the regional commissioners, and second one was of Dr Davis to ensure further updates on progress against the action plan are taken to the CCC. So sort of verbal update just on.
Yeah, so the first one was done in the written response that we made to the regional commissioner, and I picked up that action because Gail was on leave at the last meeting, so she's taking that forward as Director of Contracting. And the update with regards to the regular ambulance meeting will go to the Clinical Commissioning Committee for its first quarterly update in October.
Okay, thank you. The next action was regarding about the Health Financial Management Association e-learning training, and that was emailed around to everyone, and I'm happy to say that I've undertaken my first module and completed my first module. I'll encourage everyone else to do that. Next action was done in July, which was to arrange for a final version of the annual audit letter to be included in the governing body papers on the website. That was done. Then the final action was for Skidmore to circulate to the governing body information about the NHS long-term plan implementation framework, and that was completed. We have received some written questions from the public, from Mr. Gillard, who's here. They pose a big. We'll might have to just take a moment's break whilst we reconnect with the microphone.
I'm afraid it's broken.
I think there's a bass missing. I think we need to take a moment whilst we mend the
Sound system.
microphone. Thank you very much. So we've had some written questions from Mr. Gillard, and they have been responded to by the CCG executive team, and those responses have been included on people's tables. Thank you.
Just on question 7, there is no answer to my questions about the CCG regulations. Those are not referred to in the answer at all. And our legal advice from VD is that you do apply, and that there is a request for requirement of compensation. So could the answer be updated to include the position of the CCG on the relevance of the regulations rather than ignoring the question?
I'll ask, David's doing the update around that process, so I'll ask him to include some answer to your question, your comment when we reach that point of the agenda. So thank you. We then move on to the first paper today, which is Claire Skidmore presenting a paper around the financing, contracting, including a report on the Quality Innovation, Productivity and Prevention scheme. So, Claire.
Thank you. The report that you have in front of you is our month 4 position, so that's our year to date as at the end of July this year. We currently have an overspend at that point in the year of £5 million against our plan, so it's no surprise when you look at our forecast that we are looking at a significant overheating against the plan to date, as well as the forecast outturn. The drivers for that position are well known. There's nothing material that emerged between month 3 and 4 that's different to those areas of risk and concern that we've discussed previously. So we're still seeing overheating in our acute sector, particularly around emergency and A&E activity, as well as our ambulance activity. We have above contract expenditure across our portfolio of complex cases, and also for CHC. Albeit we talk, and we've talked regularly here about the programme of work that's in place, so we're looking to try and stem that growth as we move forward. We are also seeing some slippage in our original QUIP plans for the year, so governing body members will recall that we were looking to deliver a QUIP programme in the region of £20 million. Our current forecasts at month 4 suggest an outturn of about £17.5 million against that. We do risk assess our position, not only in terms of delivery of our QUIP programme, but also testing some of those assumptions we're making around our forecast outturn. And I think that's the area of focus really for month 4 that I wanted to make sure was brought to the committee's attention. We are still looking very likely that we will not hit our control total, our plan for this year, on the basis that despite best efforts and despite all the actions that we're taking to try and mitigate the overspends that we've got, we're still reporting at month 4 that we are likely to have an unmitigated risk or will miss that financial plan by around 18.4 million. So just to be very clear, that would mean that in year we would deliver a £41 million deficit. As you can imagine, the executive team are working very hard to stem that forecast. We're looking to reduce that forecast where we can, but also we're acknowledging the fact that we're already halfway through the year. This isn't something, and we've talked about this previously, that we're just going to commission our way out of. We've got to look at some more innovative system solutions to bring cost out of the system. There are many options that we have that would do no more than push this problem around the system, and it's really not going to fix it in the long term. So we have to find a way of looking for solutions with our broader system partners to actually get that cost out at source. We are, as you would anticipate, coming under some scrutiny now from our regulators, NHS, EI. I'm going to meet them along with the CFO from Telford and the Director of Finance from SAF on Friday to talk about this month 4 position and to talk about the actions that we're taking both individually and collectively to try and manage our position and mitigate the forecasts that we're looking at. We're seeing these significant pressures in all 3 organisations at the moment. We're not alone in this by any means. I think the final thing that I just wanted to draw attention to in my summary is the paragraph at the bottom of the summary page, which also makes reference to preparing for our Q2 reported position. As a governing body, we're going to have some challenging conversations over the next few weeks about what we think our forecast position is going to look like, and certainly I'm expecting that we'll be having some more conversations with the regulator to look at how we might report that going forward. I'll pause there. I'm happy to take any questions at that point.
Thank you, Claire. So, questions from the board? Alex.
Claire, could you say a little bit more about the Betsy Cadwallader Health Board issue?
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested to know if the work that's being done by Betsy Cadwallader was done by SAF, how much money would we save?
Okay, so the scale of the contract with Betsy Cadwallader, well, if I talk about the scale of what we spent with them last year, we've now agreed a figure for last year's activity that they performed, which is £4.3 million. So taking a very broad assumption that we could stop patients going to their hospital and we could have them in SAF, then that would be the extent of that issue. That's a very blunt way of describing it, but that's the extent of the issue. I think we've
So sorry, there's a £4 million difference?
No, there's a £4 million contract with Betsy Cadwallader.
So I think Alan's question is, if it was paid for on NHS England tariff, what would the price differential be between the two?
Oh, sorry, I see. I haven't got that figure to hand, but it's something we can pull out for circulation afterwards. That's not a problem.
Would it be half that?
No, it's not half. It's more than that. So, in summary, the issue was that they're a Welsh provider. they have a different pricing regime to England. They notified the CCG of an intent to change their pricing, which, according to the rules that we recognise, did not give us sufficient notice for that pricing change. So the debate that we've been having with them for some time is about what is a reasonable pace of change, given that we operate two different sets of rules. The negotiated position that we landed with them for last year now does take into account a pace of change rather than a full move to the Welsh pricing model. And also, as part of that negotiation, we agreed another year's worth of transition. So we won't be paying full Welsh cost for another 12 months beyond this year. That's now landed, agreed. It was a without prejudice agreement to allow Gail and her team to negotiate the 1920 contract, and that's coming to conclusion very shortly as well in terms of income paper. But yeah, I'll get that working drafted and we can circulate that after the meeting.
Thank you. Any further questions, Meredith?
Thank you very much, Claire, for the summary. Clearly, the financial position is a very difficult one. And you did say, as we can imagine, the executive team are working very hard, and I'm sure we can imagine. I think it would be useful to have an exercise in which the whole governing body takes another look at all the potential that might exist for extracting any further savings out of the system. I'm not suggesting there are any, and if any are suggested which might have a negative impact on range or quality of services, then obviously we wouldn't go near them. But Julian, I wonder if it would be just a good opportunity for us to say, hang on a minute, let's get a governing body approach to really digging around to see what might be worth considering that hasn't been considered to date.
Yeah, I definitely support that, and I think that's where our development sessions as a governing body are really helpful, because they create us that space to have that open book discussion, really. I think it's really important to emphasise what you just said there, Meredith, about testing impact and the quality impact of those decisions. I think that really helps when that's at the fore for the governing body to consider.
I think, Meredith, that's a very good suggestion, one that we should be doing and one that we have done in the past. And I think it is important to revisit it. I did have a sort of slight follow-up question to that. Obviously, Claire, you talked about potential system solutions. So obviously, we can talk about potential commissioning decisions that we could make. What work is being done, and what sort of things, when you say system solutions, what sort of things are being looked at?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of things that are going on. I'll touch on a few, and then I'm sure others around the table might want to chip in as well. If we look at some of the biggest areas of overspend, we've got non-elective being a prime example. We've got a number of work streams that are either in train or about to be kicked off that would help to, in essence, avoid admissions. So we've got some joint work with the local authority around a specific admissions avoidance scheme that will come in time for winter. We're also using through the urgent care delivery board that space with all the providers around the table, which includes the ambulance trust as well as our key providers, to look at other ways of putting projects in place that will not just benefit the commissioners. Obviously, we take that viewpoint to the table, but do genuinely take cost out of the system, so everyone wins, as it were, from that scenario. Outpatients is another example where we think that by encouraging our providers to share with us some areas of opportunity for changing the way they currently do things, we can all take a benefit out of that piece of work. Julie, do you want to highlight any of the other work streams that you're involved in?
Well, the main one is clearly linked to the non-elective and the work through the A&E delivery board. I think that's critical. And we have got name support now from the ambulance service to specific pieces of work, which is the first time we've had that. So we're very keen to pursue that, and I think that will make a difference, because the evidence suggests that our areas of pressure are ambulance conveyed patients over 75, and that's clearly to understand that demand, but also to ensure that there are appropriate alternatives in the community, which is why the emission avoidance scheme can help with that. So we are trying to target our efforts based on where the evidence is telling us we have a challenge.
In the bigger sort of system space, coming back to the avoidance of avoidable non-elective admissions, wearing my STP hat rather than my CCG hat, we called a summit last week, which was looking at what's stopping us accelerating implementation of these sorts of ideas we've been talking about for a number of months, probably years. And that brought together all the organisations in the local patch to ask the question, are we clear about what we're trying to achieve? Are we clear what impediments there are to us achieving that at scale, and what might we do about that? And while I can't claim we came to solutions that will suddenly improve our position in year, we recognise, well, one very encouraging thing was there was definitely a collective view that there are real opportunities to develop services that could keep people out of hospital who don't need to go into hospital, and it's not that there's an absence of collective vision, so that's encouraging. Secondly, we concluded what kinds of things are stopping us making quick progress, and a lot of it came down to a sense of relative priority of this work compared to everything else, and that we hadn't necessarily collectively pinned down absolute priorities that we all could say we had signed up to and put the capacity in to deliver those priorities at pace. So the next steps are to ensure we have got that collective view as to what the priorities are. Now, these are not things that are going to change our plans over the next 6 months and bring ourselves back into financial balance in the next 6 months, but they do, hopefully, I think, give us permission to drive some of this forward at faster pace than we have in the past. So I was encouraged by that. I think it does give us a mandate to press on with that. The sort of view was we should treat this just as urgently as a management and clinical endeavour as we do the front end of A&E. So the system nationally and locally has tended to look at the immediate problem in front of us rather than the potential solutions with the same endeavour. So, yes, I can't claim this will solve the problem overnight, but I think it does give us some optimism that there is a will and a collective determination to make progress faster than we have in the past.
Good. Thank you. Any further questions? I've got a couple of small questions. One is about the paragraph 11 talks about the NHS E&I process. Yeah. One is just for clarity. Obviously, although our control total hasn't altered and it's still at the 12.3 million, they have in effect accepted our plan as a de facto control total. Is that how they're sort of dealing with it? There is no expectation that isn't our sort of target we're working to?
No, we've had confirmation that that's the target, yeah.
And in terms of the sort of support and process for HC&I, do you anticipate getting further support from them, not in terms of financial support, but in terms of capacity and to look afresh at our financial challenges, or do you think?
It's not been part of the offer in terms of the specific CCGs, whether whether there'll be a discussion about that on Friday, I honestly don't know. That's not been mooted. I think there's been a more general discussion at STP and system level, as I understand it, about what do we need as a system. But certainly I've not been approached to date in terms of that sort of additional capacity type support that we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Okay. And just leading on to that, obviously one of the things about SAF and the comment about the overspend currently and that the run rate will slow down due to delivery of QIP. It was more those sort of areas around the QIP delivery and the QIP sort of programme support where we previously had support from NHC, and whether it is worthwhile, going back to them and saying, do we need, would we need more capacity and more support, or would it help, or are we now expected to get that through the STP?
I think from my sort of overview of the QUIP programme that we've got, and particularly those elements that impact on our non-elective activity, I don't think we necessarily need additional commissioner capacity. It's more at the end of the providers where we need pairs of hands to do the doing to actually get the schemes off the ground and working. So that would be my judgment of where, if we were to inject capacity, that's where it would be better served.
Thank you. That's fine. Any further questions? If not, we're asked to note the financial report and to note the financial position, and obviously to, as a board, note the challenge we're facing and the urgency required to develop mitigations. And we now welcome the session from Meredith about having a further board level workshop to actually look at what we are doing, what we can do, and what we can accelerate. And also we note the anticipated protocol for amending the reporting position, which is detailed in the report. So thank you for that. We'll move on to the next paper, which is the Quality Exception Performance Report, which is presented jointly by Chris and Julie.
Thank you. So Julie and I will take the paper as read, and we will answer any questions. Just to bring to the board's attention, at the last meeting we tried to integrate the report. We've done some further work on it, but we recognise that formatting and how it looks will need some further work to be done, so bear with us on that one. The information within the report covers months 3 and 4, and in some areas there's just annual data that's available for reporting. So that's because it's national data and we only receive it on an annual basis. The key issues are detailed in the report where the CCG is not delivering on the key standards, and I think it's fair to say that they're unfortunately well-known issues that we continue to be monitoring and addressing through our contract and quality performance processes. And we're happy to take any questions on that. Good news around the IAPT performance. I think for first time for quite a while we've been able to go over the target number, which is really positive for patients requiring that provision in Shropshire, and we would expect that continues throughout the remainder of the year. A&E performance continues to be a significant challenge. We see variances in performance throughout the week and throughout the day and the night periods, and they're mainly related to staffing and obviously flow of patients through the department. There was one 12-hour breach within April. Harm performance process has been followed up on that individual, and whilst that patient's experience wasn't good and wasn't what we would want for ourselves or for any patient, there's no evidence of harm that patient suffered. But we continue to monitor that through ad hoc spot visits to A&Es to check on individual patient oversight of their care. There's been no 52-week waiters, which again is another positive. Our biggest challenge from a quality perspective and service delivery perspective is around workforce, and the Director of Nursing and Quality from the Trust said yesterday that there were over 300 nurse vacancies in the organisation, which is a big figure that we haven't heard before. So I do welcome her transparency and the work that she's doing to try and understand those issues and to address them. She very clearly articulated the international recruitment that is being undertaken, but similarly articulated that in the last 12 months, 170 nurses have been recruited into the organisation, but through turnover, 190 have left. So clearly there is a lot of work to be done around recruitment and retention, particularly retention of the nursing workforce in the organisation. They are using continue to use considerable amounts of banking agency, and the Trust are doing a lot of work around securing up their bank, actually doing some benchmarking terms and conditions across the country to try and encourage their own staff to to work on the bank rather than use agency. As part of the mitigation, clearly they are block booking. They're working very closely with the agencies that are providing, on the framework that are providing workforce to the trust, and they are block booking staff for considerable periods of time to ensure that there's continuity and support. And those agency staff are going through the trust's internal training processes and oversight, so to try and mitigate the risk as much as possible. I think it was refreshing to hear the interim workforce director and the new nurse director talk openly about the challenges and the actions that they're putting in place to try and promote SAF as, you know, an employer of choice, which clearly is difficult at this time, but actually something which they are striving to deliver. Last time we reported challenges, particularly around the autism service within MPFT, and we're pleased to report that now additional capacity has been sought to address the backlog in terms of the waiting list there, and to a new pathway is in the process of being finalised to agree the flow of children, young people through that pathway in the future to prevent those backlogs from occurring. Julie, is there anything else that you wanted to add that I haven't said?
That covers it. Thanks, Chris.
Okay.
Sorry, pathway is still not very clear with regards autism.
Yeah, the pathway we talk about is a new one. It's
Yes, I
just
know.
been developed with us and our local authority colleagues, and with the schools and education. So that will come through both CCG's governance processes during this month, which will give colleagues a chance to comment on the new model, and then hopefully that will address some of the issues, because you're absolutely right, we've still got issues. This is around how we address it in a more sustainable way for the future.
The trouble is they're also pushing more onto schools. Now, that's very good when people are at school, but when they're on summer holiday, they were still asking for assessments through schools, which is a bit weird.
Well, that's what we'll address with the new model. Yeah.
It's better, but there's still a lot of baggage, and it's not ideal still.
So,
It's very early days at the moment, but I absolutely take your point, and we'll do that.
a few people who want to ask questions. I wanted to just follow up particularly about the ADHD and the timeline for it, because I can't quite remember the numbers, but there was 250 to 300 children who are waiting assessments, of which over 100 have waited longer than a year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good that we're proposing a sort of a pathway to improve that. I mean, I think some of the issues Mike raised about new referrals are slightly immaterial when there's 300, well, they're not immaterial, they're very important, but there's 300 children waiting for assessment. I was wondering, do we have a sort of in our minds, if not already agreed, a sort of a timeline and an anticipated date by which point that tail of patients will be cleared?
I don't know.
No.
I'll have to check, and we can circulate that. I think if we can be clear that there are two things. There's one, there's addressing the current waiting list, which we prioritise the ones over 12 months, but we clearly need to address the other children and young people that are waiting for assessment and potential diagnosis. The model for the future is the bit about how do we get this sustainable, because the fact is it's been kind of done in isolation rather than that more holistic and integrated approach, and that's why by linking in education, and absolutely making alternative provisions when it's kind of school holidays, but making all of that kind of join up will help to, if you like, to manage the demand into the service so it's then sustainable for the capacity, the clinical capacity we've got. But we'll check the timescales against the, because we'd identified the resource. It's taken a while to find the capacity to deliver that. We'll get the timescales on which those over 12 months will be cleared, and we'll circulate that to governing body members. Two
follow-up things to that. One is, as someone communicated to the families that are waiting, that people check that things are not deteriorated. Because obviously if someone had been referred routinely and it may now be urgent, the situation may have deteriorated. And the second one is there's going to be a sort of subject to clinical prioritisation. There won't be a situation where children being referred in now will be seen sooner than those children waiting for you. We'll make sure that in fact the backlog is cleared in a prioritisation and a time order.
Clinical urgency first and time waiting second, yes.
I've got questions from Deborah, then Finola and Jess, and then whoever else.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the improvements to the layout. I particularly like the kind of risks and actions taken there. That was really helpful. I just wanted to highlight last month, I think we noticed that the children's cancer performance had deteriorated for the first time, and it's still pretty alarming this month, and I just wondered if we knew a bit more of what was behind that and what action had been taken.
On the children,
Just in here.
on the terms of this,
Yeah, page 5 of the report.
yes, the 75% versus the 91.3. We didn't have the detail through. We asked for an exception report. We didn't have one for children's cancer at the last planned care working group. We've escalated that internally within SATH, and hopefully I should have that. I'm hoping by the end of this week. We had the meeting a week last Thursday. Again, the key points out of that, I don't expect governing bodies members to wait. When I've got that, I'll circulate that for information.
Okay, thank you. Finola?
Yeah, it was, again, it's just linked to referrals. I know, you know, we've known for a while some of the areas have been deteriorating in 2-week referrals, and we're well cited on some of the capacity issues. I know from going to the LMC and talking to GPs, they're very cited on the pressures, but equally they feel it would help them to know a bit more around where the pressure areas are and what are some of those delays looking like, so that they can inform patients. And I just wondered if we're communicating sufficiently to practices around, you know, as I say, people well citing the issues, but just what are the weights like realistically, it's just so that they can set patient expectations, and also, I suppose, maybe decide on appropriate referral given there may be some delays.
Yeah, we can link that through the various newsletters that we send out to primary care. We'll have to link that in with SATH, because obviously the 2-week sort of goes directly to the provider and not to us, so we don't necessarily know that right at that minute, that up to date. But if we can link, we can certainly make a link there when we. I'll talk to Nikki, and we know in advance when the newsletters are going out. We can get the latest information from Shrewsbury and Telford and include that in the newsletter.
Because just, I mean, as you know, Julie, there's a sort of wider issue around some specialities are experiencing a delay in routine referrals as well.
Because they are prioritising the cancer work, and another piece of work that we're trying to do through the planned care working group that we've linked with the clinical quality review is we're also aware that, I should be careful how I choose my words here, that potentially we are having patients referred under the 2-week rule, because clearly doctors are anxious that their patients get seen quickly and there's no perceived access to an urgent appointment. What we're trying to do with the hospital is to identify the areas where that's causing a problem and say, if we could make urgent capacity available, we're working with through the clinical quality review to identify the criteria, because obviously it would be really important to specify what that clinically urgent criteria was. And then that's the sort of, again, that's a sort of medium-term action to try and again get the sustainable, so we get patients seen at the right time and on the right pathway, because potentially at the moment we're putting too much through a 2-week and a cancer pathway that's kind of deteriorating our performance there, and we could deliver it more effectively and better for patients in a different way. So that's what we're trying to do for the longer term.
And I know it would be helpful for you to know which specialities GPs are noticing a delay in, because that allows you to sort of try and to target that approach, and that might be some of the locality teams might be able to
definitely, that would be really appreciated.
Do you think it's a difficult message to give around 2-week referrals? Because I know you chose your words wisely, but it was, I think I saw a few red flags flying past the window. In terms of, you know, this is a capacity issue at the hospital rather than referral issue. The pickup rate, you know, for 2-week referrals is supposed to be 1 to 2% chance of picking up a malignancy. Yeah. And I think sometimes, you know, I don't think we can criticise GPs for referring people under the 2-week rule, when in fact, you know, that's what we're encouraging people to do, and the national drive is to increase that, whereas the problem is a capacity and an organisational problem at the hospital rather than a referral problem.
And it wasn't what I was saying, it's the category Because absolutely, if it is query cancer, then the 2-week is absolutely correct. It's we do know, and there is evidence, that that is being used for access to an urgent consultant appointment. And what we're saying is that if we could do that properly with the right clinical criteria, it would make the best use of that clinical capacity. Because that's what we're trying to do. It's not, we absolutely, of course, the National Direction of Travel is earlier diagnosis of cancer, so we would expect that to increase. And we've got to make sure that you're absolutely right, that we've got the relevant diagnostic and assessment capacity to meet that demand.
So we've got Jess and then John, and then
I've got two relatively quick ones. I think probably they both steer more that way than that way, although you'll work it out. The first is around urology treatment, so cancer treatment delays. And I was just wondering, because this has been on the board for a while now, do we understand, do we have any additional detail around the impact of that? So how long people are waiting, or if it's affecting outcomes? I appreciate that most of the time these are slow-growing malignancies, but they're actually not exclusively slow-growing. And it would be useful to understand what impact we're seeing as a result of this, really.
There's not been anything specifically raised at our end. I'd expect if that's being tracked, how it's usually done is where there's been a delay in either the patient being seen or in the treatment, then that triggers the harm pro forma, and that would be reported up through the clinical quality review meeting. And I've not had anything come back that's identified any issues.
So nothing's come through CQRM?
No.
Okay.
But we continue to ask the question.
We could be, perhaps if we just double check.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, it's been standing there for a little while, and it may be that there is no harm, but we try to prioritise cancer treatments for a reason, don't we?
Absolutely.
The second was on page 19 of the report, or page 78 of the whole pack. There's just a little bit about a number of concerns being raised by GPs in relation to the community team and criteria for accepting referrals. And the action against that describes meetings taking place between the Trust Commissioners and Quality Team to monitor and review care and to ensure accurate service specs are in place. I suppose I was just seeking reassurance, really, that my understanding is correct and that we are not suddenly expecting the pace of those discussions around the service specs to pick up, so that will be the answer that enables care, but we will be ensuring that adequate care is provided whilst those discussions take place, because history would suggest that is a protracted conversation.
Okay. No, your first assumption was correct.
Okay.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, just about the bit, Julie, that you mentioned about being some evidence that the 2-week wait pathway is possibly being used due to a lack of or a difficulty in accessing urgent appointments. Do we have data on that? I mean, I would be personally surprised if that sort of activity was significant enough to skew or to hinder the 2-week targets. And leading on from that, could it be potentially be indicative of the fact we don't have a vague symptom pathway, which sometimes patients don't fit in easily to a 2-week wait pathway, even though there's a genuine concern.
And that's been raised as well, John, and we're tackling both of those things. Yeah. So we take the evidence from SAF at a specialty level, and that's why we've tried to target the discussion around the urgent and the clinical criteria to those where we take their advice in terms of where they feel that's material for their capacity. But you're absolutely right, the vague symptoms is an area that we do need to develop, and we are behind in our approach on that.
And just secondly, on just page 2, para 3, just about the A&E performance, I think it's probably trying to say that having shown signs of, I take it to be, of improvement in May. Do we know what were the factors that helped it improve in May, if there was it that there was lower activity coming through A&E? Was it a better staffing ratio?
A combination of both of those things.
Of those two,
yeah.
Okay. And the factor that's deteriorated since then is it activity or staffing? These were the summer months.
It's a combination. I think we've seen a particular issue, particularly around the bank holiday in August, around staffing, that's caused a fairly catastrophic impact on performance. Although actually the activity was no more than plan, but staffing levels were particularly challenging. And again, you get various combinations of those things that are the two biggest determinants of the performance.
Yeah, following up about A&E, one of the other points is about the fill rate of the Shropshire shifts. I was wondering what impact that has, and what other impacts do we know about impacts on primary care. I went to I'd like to say a conversation with Simon Stevens, but I think it was a lecture because there was about 300 of us there. And he made the point that obviously nationally there's 25 million A&E appointments a year and 300 million GP appointments. So I think he used the word, you need a perceived decrease in GP availability to actually, or even or an actual decrease to hit a really big impact on the same day attendance at the hospital. So I was wondering what impact we thought the Shropshire fill rate of 95% of shifts, whether that impacted on A&E performance. And likewise, do we have any figures around GP access, about whether there's been any change? Particularly, I worry about the introduction of extended hours on top of the sort of extended access, which obviously is good for improving patient access, but may also reduce the availability of in-hours GPs, and whether that is a consideration that we've looked at.
We've certainly looked at the out of hours, because that again is an obvious out of both to look in terms of A&E attendances and potentially increased in demand in 999 and then ultimately ambulance conveyancing. We have seen, we're trying to unpick, we've seen a change. There was a change last October, and we know that was when we had the new contract was implemented for Shropshire. Unfortunately, we've got other factors that we're also in play at that time in terms of staffing levels and some of the systems and processes that were changed in the hospital. And that's one of the next sort of layers that we're trying to unpick, which is exactly how much was down to kind of the staffing and systems and processes in the hospital, and what, if any, can we link to any changes in terms of out of hours. We are trying to map, because now we do get the staffing fill rates, we are trying to map where we've got low incidence there. Does that spike? Does that correlate with that? We've got no direct causal link on that at the moment. And with regard to GP access, we've not made that link yet, but I'm sure I can pick that up with Nikki and see how, again, like we're trying to do with Shropshire, we can try and track it over time and see if there's any evidence of any causal effect.
As far as I know, we don't have kind of daily or even monthly figures on GP relative access, do we?
We
so
don't.
It'd be quite hard to do that analysis. All we've got is the patient survey data, which is annual.
We can do the Shropshire, but we struggle on that.
While you can surmise, I think it'd be quite difficult to have a kind of data-driven analysis of it, because there isn't any data.
We don't know what.
Fine, just a point.
Yeah, no,
I accept those.
I think certainly there's probably a stronger link on that on the Telford and Wrekin side of the county than there is Shropshire, but again, there's no way we don't measure the appointments.
Attendances at A&E mapped to GP practice, haven't we? It's not relative per head of population.
Yeah. And that's the means that we're looking at it. We're tackling it at a practice where we've got a disproportionate level of attendances relative to their standardised list size that's obviously factored in their
again, there are other
demographics and
factors like how
deprivation.
close the practice is to the
proximity is the biggest single determinant, nothing else.
It's not quite as straightforward as it sounds.
That's right. Got Finola with a question.
Sorry, it's just linked, I think, to the same section you're looking at, Julian. The last sentence, it's going from page 13 to page 14 of the report. No GP shifts for NHS 111 CAS were covered.
Yeah, by Shropshire. By our Shropshire, yeah.
So by our Shropshire. So okay, so that's not
elsewhere, but they're not our Shropshire and not fulfilling their contractual obligations.
We, as part of the contract with Care UK, as part of the combined collaborative contract with Care UK, each out-of-hours provider is expected to provide a session for the clinical assessment centre in 111. All that's saying is that Shropshire didn't, obviously, because they hadn't got the staff. I'm assuming they hadn't got the staff, but that then is covered by another out-of-hours provider. So it would be covered by someone from Birmingham or Dudley.
We are working with the Community Trust, who obviously our contract with is for that, to trying to see, can we overcome that? Is there some ways of working around that to encourage? Because it would clearly give us benefit, even if we could target our Shropshire capacity to the Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin patients out of hours, and that's what we're endeavouring to do at the moment. And I'm in discussions with Steve Gregory at Shropcom to try and address that before this winter.
Because that's something that may be having an impact, because if it's been covered by another area,
It could be,
then
absolutely.
they're not familiar with
I
what's
think
available locally.
That is a potential issue for NOLA, but they cover the whole of the footprint, not just Shropshire, so they would be acting on behalf
Okay.
of
The other areas.
the wider footprint.
Okay.
I think as well, we've got to remember that come November, the clinical assessment centre will be GP, paramedic, you know, it will be combined within WMAS.
Yes.
So that's an opportunity for us as well then to start pressing some of those buttons around what's actually on the Directory of Services and to, you know, manage access to what's on the Directory of Services rather than worrying about whether we've got a GP from Shropdock taking calls in the call centre, because, you know, it should be sufficiently clinically staffed. What we need to do and get right is make sure that our Directory of Services is up to date, and where it's not responsive, that we get that feedback so we can then pick it up with our providers.
Meredith.
Thanks very much. Just to say, first of all, I really welcome the bringing together of quality and performance in the report, and also I see it much more in the way the organisation is working. So I think that integration is very helpful and must be the right way forward. My main point, though, is around the workforce issue, and I accept it's a workforce issue for SAF, but since it has a major impact on our patients, I wonder if you have a good understanding of why 190 nurses are leaving, outstripping the recruitment drive. And A, is that an exceptional figure for SAF, or is there something happening in addition to all the other things that we know about? You know, what's your kind of understanding of what's behind that figure?
So, Meredith, there are many factors into that, in response to that question, and we have asked the Trust for that detail. They do exit interviews with staff when they're leaving the organisation to try and ascertain what those reasons are, and they present a summary, a very headline summary of that. So you would expect a churn of nurse staffing between 8 and 10%. That's a sort of national figure that you would see in other organisations. Some places it's higher, some places it's lower. And I think historically in this patch we've had quite low turnover rates amongst our staff, because once you come to Shropshire you tend to stay in Shropshire. But clearly we have numbers of reasons why those nurses are moving. We have an ageing workforce. So there are nurses coming up, you know, to retirement, taking early retirement. We have nurses who are really struggling with the shift work. They work 12-hour days in the organisation, and so they choose to go onto the bank. So they're not losing all of those nurses. A lot of them are choosing to work more flexibly on the bank and work the hours that they want to work, that fits in with their home and family life. There are nurses that are unhappy at being moved around constantly from shift to shift to cover other ward areas, short-term staffing, and you know that again that's understandable. There are nurses that want to progress their careers and are moving on because they've sought employment in other organisations and got promotions. So there are multiple reasons why the gaps are there. What I keep pushing the Trust, and they recognise in themselves, is that they need to consider more flexibly how they address those reasons. So if long shifts are a problem, and that's something nationally which is being discussed, then actually be more flexible with your staff about the shifts that they cover. because their nurses are a really valuable commodity that they need to keep to deliver quality care. So we continue to ask the question. We get that mix of answers every time we do, and I think probably there's a lot of reason in those responses. But the trust recognise they've got to work harder on retaining the nurses once they've got them in. They're doing a lot of work with the local universities now. Wolverhampton University is starting nurse training on the Telford campus in the near future, which is really good. We're doing some work with Chester University to look at how we can bring those nurses to work in our county, along with Keele and Staffordshire. So really looking at how we can grow nurses from within and encourage that pathway from nursing through, from healthcare assistants through nursing associates through to registered nurses, and keep them on the patch.
I suppose for me, when you introduced that originally, the focus on greater transparency is an encouraging sign. I think that is how we should work. We should be open about these issues and challenges. And secondly, I reiterate the we that you said there. I don't think this is what the trust needs to do on its own. I think there's something about how we as a whole system, including us as CCGs, support this, because it's not just a SATH problem, it's a primary care problem, it's a mental health provider problem. It's how working together is going to add value, rather than us looking over the boundaries of the organisation and just asking questions. I don't think that's enough. I think it's seeking to develop kind of an overall workforce strategy for the whole patch, not just for one organisation. But they're kind of long-term ambitions. Obviously, you don't turn that around overnight. But I do welcome the transparency. It's got to be a good start. But we will have to keep working at this.
I think you've got Alan.
I was always very anxious when they moved over to 12-hour shifts. Anxious about whether older nurses would cope with 12 hours, a long time on a busy ward. And also because I feel if you're feeling slightly off colour, you're wondering about coming in, you might be able to face an 8-hour shift, but perhaps not a shift that runs from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So I think it was a bad move to move to 12-hour shifts. I also understand it's difficult to run a ward with nurses working 12 hours and others working 8 hours. So this was something pushed through by HR. It was said to be welcomed by a lot of nurses with younger families, I can see that. But I'd really like to know what impact that's had on older nurses and on the sickness rate.
Thank you. One further question from me, which is just about to highlight about on page 19 of the report, is about which is a positive thing, obviously, about the respect. Two questions. One is if you could just perhaps brief us a little bit about that and what that means, but also I did have a query about the engagement with primary care, because there was a comment about the fact that they've been discussing primary care engagement, but I do question how much engagement has occurred with primary care as a provider with regards to, I think, the respect and having a single form you move across the health economy across different providers is a brilliant idea, and it's going to be it is something very positive for patient care. So one is just a brief update to the board about it, and the other one is just about if you could explain what's being done about engaging with primary care, which would be the main provider to use this.
Okay, so the Respect programme is the national programme, which is really about individuals almost having an anticipatory care plan for the end of their life, being able to articulate their wishes and be supported to have their wishes as their condition changes and they become closer to the end of life. And so that their family and friends and health professionals caring for them understand those wishes and can plan accordingly with their consent. So there is a group that has been in place for some time now that's chaired by Professor Willis at the hospice, and he's been working with all partners across the system. So our hospital trust has been representatives from the CCG in forum to look at how do we have a coordinated approach across the system? How do we document somebody's wishes, and how do we make sure that those wishes are respected? And in the past, we've had lots of attempts to do this right that sort of have stalled. But I think there is a real desire now to make this happen. So there's a series of documentation which will follow the patient, that will enable those caring for the patient to understand what their wishes are. In terms of how GPs are involved in this, I'm not absolutely clear, other than other than I think information has gone out to practices. So please do.
Yeah, so speak.
Yeah, do you want to
SPIC.
Sorry, so SPIC, they are rolling out a training programme for general practices across the county, for Telford and Wrekin and Shropshire as well. There is, as Chris said, there's an end-of-life group chaired by Derek Willett that's actually meeting tomorrow, and Ellen Nolan in Telford and Jill Clements in Shropshire are the GP representatives, and they are designing the rollout plan and training plan with practices. So it's initiated from the 1st of November, the 31st of October, so that there is a plan in place to engage with practices. So it's a single form that goes with the patient, so all care providers, so the patient, whether it was the ambulance, whoever, it's a consistent form and a consistent set of information when wherever the patient touches, either community, acute, primary care, or even local authority care.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there are engagement with primary care happening. There's 5 meetings been arranged, 1-day courses, 3 in Wellington and 2 in Shrewsbury. It looks like 3 have happened. Yeah, one was yesterday, one was tomorrow. And the locality manager, certainly in the south, has been contacting practices to try and seek an appropriate time and venue to arrange 3-hour training sessions.
Yeah, it's like a catch-up.
Yeah, I think the course was more about training trainers, and so they are trying to. I don't think they've had huge enthusiasm, but they're trying to interact with.
Mike.
Yeah, this has been debated in our practice because there's lots of issues, which is 2 sheets now rather than the 1 DNAR, which was, and one of the issues we had with DNAR was that it was place specific, which caused lots of problems, and some of our concerns is the changeover from DNAR to this new system. As long as it doesn't mean we have to go and redo everything else. So at the moment, it's only just really been discussed in the practice, and while we do see some advantages, again, our concern is about the document of where it is living, how it's looked after, how is it transported, and how people actually can access its issues. So we are in support of it, but we are just a little concerned as to what it is. Hopefully, it will take the good things out of the Liverpool pathway and the DNAR and leave the bad things of the Liverpool pathway miles behind. So at the moment, that does seem to be the thing that's coming in, but I think it's early days to say what GPs are doing, because we literally have only just really been approached and started with it.
The training does address that, to those specific things. It's one document that's recognised by all organisations, so it won't need to be repeated every time anyone goes in and out of hospital. It stays with the patient and should follow.
But then you've got to make sure the patient takes it with it.
Yeah. You're allowed to keep copies of it, but the original is supposed to stay with the patient.
Thank you for that. I think it's good to end on a positive. I think the respect form is going to be a big positive for patient care. So we're asked as a governing body to note the contents of the performance and quality report and the actions contained within it. So thank you. Rather than having the break now, if we move on to the next paper, which ties in with this really, because it's the Learning Disabilities Mortality Review Annual Report.
Thank you. So Helen Bailey is our system lead for the leader work, and she apologises she couldn't be here to present the paper in person. The paper summarises the work that has happened at a national level and a local level over the past 2 years, so from April 17 to March 2019. I won't go into the detail of the paper other than to say that as a system we have really committed reviewers that are doing our local case reviews. They're doing those in a timely way, and we've had some national recognition for the fact that our process is working very, very well. And we don't have a backlog of reviews waiting, which means that learning from those reviews gets fed back and embedded into future practice, and clearly that's the aim of the whole process. So I'd like the board to recognise that, you know, the good work of Helen Bailey and all of the reviewers that are actually undertaking this work, because it is really important that there is learning from the deaths of individuals with a learning disability, and that we're constantly reviewing how their care works.
Thank you. Any questions for Nola?
Yes, I think I would echo what you've said there. There is clearly a lot of work being done, and this might be a reflection of what I'm about to ask, actually. I just wanted to clarify, just sense checking the summary, but also it says in the main document that 49 deaths have been reported between June 2017 and whenever it was, June 2017, April and March 2019. But 29 deaths have been reported by Shropshire. So is the 49 the number that have been reported nationally, of which we've reported 29? Or?
29 are our Shropshire patients.
And in the first paragraph, it talks about 49 deaths have been notified since the programme started in June 2017.
I don't know the answer to that point for Nola. I know that the review process will take all of the deaths, and then not all of them will go through to be fully reviewed. But I have to check that out with Helen, because the reviewers will look at all the deaths and say, is there any reason why we should review this case? Is there any indication that would tell us that we need to do that? Yes. I think probably that's the difference in the figure, but
is that what that means?
It might be a typo. If you look at the main part of the report, it says during 18-19, 29 deaths. So I think the 49 is since June 2017. 29, it should say April 2018 to March 2019. That would make sense, but we just need to check that.
Okay, and that 49 is a regional figure, not or a local figure,
not a... No, 49 is the Shropshire and Telford region, but it's since June 2017.
Okay.
The 29, I think, is it says in the main report 2018-19, which would be April 2018 to March 2019.
That first sentence under section 4 isn't clear, is it? It says
we'll need to double check it, but that's what I think.
I'll just double check those figures with Helen. I'm sure she would have explained it if she was here.
Yeah, and I'd just echo that actually being part of this and seeing this in action is a very positive thing. And the team that come to look at the data, look at the factors involved is excellent. It's a good process.
I'll feed that back.
I have something on this. So the reason that nationally this is a programme is we know that the life expectancy of people with learning disabilities is way lower than the average member of the population, and we know that there have been failings in care nationally, and I think the reassuring part here is, although there is one case that's shown as having a failing in care, in the vast majority that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, if it isn't, if you look at the age profile of the deaths there have been, it's clearly way lower than you would expect in the average population. So if it isn't failings of care, what's behind the deaths of people with learning disabilities at a younger age than the rest of the population? Not a straightforward question, I acknowledge, so clinical colleagues have also...
I would assume learning difficulties often don't happen in isolation, that people often may have physical disabilities or genetic Down syndrome, for example, that would increase your risk of cardiac conditions, for example,
So it's complexity
or
of
dementia,
multi.
or you know, that would, you know, so that would be unavoidable in some respects. I would imagine, I speculate.
Increased risk of dementia as well, even learning disabilities. It's usually syndromes rather than anything else. Also, they are, again, it is quality of home, and they do tend to, the problem with them living in sheltered accommodation, which is very good. There's various levels of sheltered accommodation, of which you're also dependent on staff. So it's not an easy one to say why it is.
On page 82, we just mentioned about common causes, pneumonia, sepsis, and
Chris, just going back to the numbers, on page 5 of the report, section 5, it says 61% of the reviews notified have been completed, so that actually would fit in with 61% of 49 is 26. So perhaps it's 26 reviews have been completed since June, but 49 deaths have been notified. Does that mean there's still those other reviews outstanding?
Yes, there are still reviews outstanding, and that, you know, they are allocated to reviewers, but they do take some considerable time, and they are on top of the day job usually for our reviewers, and that's one of the risks that's highlighted in the report, that we are, you know, increases do cause a problem from a capacity perspective. But there are some reviews still outstanding, you're absolutely right, but our outstanding reviews are far less than other communities across the country. So in that respect, we're seen as having more positive performance.
Chris, can I just ask about the on those common causes of death? Aspiration pneumonia is one of them. Is there anything come out of the LEADER programme to suggest there's any difficulty in access to SALT teams, in swallowing assessments, or?
I think in this one particular case that was an issue.
Okay.
So that has been that learning point has been fed through the system.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We've got Colin, sorry.
I just wonder if it might be helpful to give a comparison with either regional data or national data when we're looking at these deaths, because the numbers seem striking, obviously tragic, and it might either help us not worry so much about it or help us to identify what, you know, if there are problems.
We can certainly do that. I guess it's when would you like that? Do you want that at the next board? Would you like that if we can get that data, which I'm sure we will be able to.
In 2 months' time, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we bring a summary with that.
And I think to clarify the numbers, I think there is some query around numbers.
Yeah, of course.
And I do think this idea, point 3 about nationally 86% of the expected deaths, and I think that's a context, is that the number that we're seeing reported? And if not, do we need to do more to increase awareness that all deaths are notified of people with learning disabilities?
Okay.
Thank you.
No.
That's fine. We are asked to, I think on page 1 of the report, I think the action required is to just be updated, is to receive and note the content of this LEADER annual update report rather than provide an exception report. Other than that, that's fine. So thank you. If we now have our 10-minute break, it's nearly 2:15, and then we'll come back to David about the update on the future strategic commissioning. Thank you. reconvene. We're going to start with the update on future strategic commissioning arrangements, which David's going to present his paper briefly. Then prior to opening it up to questions, Pete Gillard just wants to ask one further point of clarification with regards to his question, which obviously we have rules to be broken, although they're not to be broken again, and not by anyone other than me. So, David.
Thank you. I'm intrigued to know that I'm allowed to break the rules now. Right, so thank you, Chair. So the paper you have in front of you sets out our progress on work to seek to establish a single CCG across Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin. As you remember, we agreed back in May that we would seek to do this by April 2020. So I'll just run through quickly the highlights of the report and then open up to questions. So the first point in the paper is in relation to the appointment of a single accountable officer. You will recall our first step in terms of establishing a shared management team is to do that. The recruitment is still progressing. A recommendation has been made through to NHS England and is waiting sign-off. So the paper rather hopefully says we'll hear in early September. I think that's a NHS England version of early. We don't know when we'll get a formal response to that. I am hopeful it will be sooner rather than later, but I honestly don't know. It's not within our control. Second point was when we established the work programme and discussed at the board, you wished assurance that we had sufficient capacity inside the organisation to take the work forward, given that we also, as you well know, have a very significant day job to be proceeding with. So we've done a number of things in terms of addressing capacity. We have appointed, together with Shropshire, with Telford and Wrekin, Deloitte as a partner in relation to our organisational development work. The reason for that is that they bring expertise on organisational development and experience of working with other CCGs on establishing shared, integrated new organisations, and therefore they have skills and capacity we simply don't have inside the CCG. It's not a significant contract, and so we're being quite careful how we, significant scale, so we're being quite careful how we deploy that resource, and it will be particularly important in the development, supporting us in the development of the operating model and in the work with our staff and partners and members on how we turn sort of high-level ideas into practical reality, which then in turn will inform how we design our management structure. So that's an important piece of extra capacity. We've also established a PMO function working through the local commissioning support unit to help with the logistics of pulling our planning together, and we have also through the CSU engaged some additional HR capacity, recognising that the second phase of the work as we design the integrated management team across the single organisation, that will involve a significant amount of HR work across with our staff group. So that's the capacity we've put in place. We've established, in governance terms, we've established a joint executive group which brings the executives from both CCGs together and meeting once, so we don't meet separately now as a Shropshire executive or as a Telford and Wrekin executive. We meet together to enact all our business, not just the work on the single organisation. That's had added benefits of immediately getting some of the benefits of scale and doing things once rather than twice, and that in itself has helped free up a little bit of capacity. But we're also using that as the oversight of the work on establishing a single organisation, so that we haven't had to set parallel, separate organisational structure up for that work. Underneath that, there's a very detailed action plan that sets out the full work programme that the PMO have developed, but they broadly go into a number of broad work streams. So probably the most significant one in some ways is the functionality work stream. That comes back to the operating model and how we will organise the management structure to deliver that operating model. That also has overseen the development of a draft commissioning strategy, a draft financial strategy, which is in parallel to commissioning strategy, that as a separate work stream. But obviously the two interrelate. So our commissioning strategy needs to drive our financial. Our finance strategy needs to. Other way around. Our commissioning strategy needs to drive our financial strategy. We've also incorporated the primary care strategy, which was already a piece of work that was in hand and has been through our primary care committee, and that's a joint piece of work across the two CCGs, and work on a draft procurement strategy, which again is work we had in hand and had intended to do, but is now being done both for the here and now and for the establishment of a new organisation. So a lot of work in that area. In terms of communications and engagement, which I think is where the question we've got particularly relates, we've established a communications engagement work stream, so that the draft communication engagement plan they've developed is in the papers that you have before you. We, on the question of the requirement to do public consultation, we have sought legal advice, and our advice is that what we are doing is in line with our legal requirements. So we are confident that our approach is entirely within the legal requirements that CCGs operate under. The specific statute that's referenced in the question, which we'll come back to, relates to how the board, which is originally was the NHS Commissioning Board, but now is NHS E&I, how they judge an application to dissolve CCGs. And again, we are confident, because that's the process they are asking us to go through in putting our submission in, we are confident that work we are doing will fulfil their requirement, but in the end that's a judgment for NHS E&I rather than a judgment for us. The finance work, as I say, is again critical. So in our application to form a single CCG, a key question is going to be, how does that new CCG, how are our new plans going to help deliver our medium-term financial strategy? Now, that's work we were doing anyway. Again, that's work we're doing underneath the banner of the long-term plan and as part of the STP. But clearly, so we're not doing the work twice. We are doing the work in the context of the long-term plan and the STP, but that will feed into our commissioning financial medium-term plan. HR I've already reported back on. And in terms of governance, the initial proposition is the establishment of a shadow board at the point we get a decision to proceed to establish the new CCG. Obviously, we won't preempt that decision. And we have developed proposals for how that shadow board would be formulated. Again, that is being presented back through NHS England, and we'll need their approval to, it's one of the elements they are looking at in their approval process. In terms of timeline, the key next steps are the vote of the membership in Shropshire CCG and a parallel process in Telford and Wrekin CCG. We have to have support of our membership to both dissolve the existing CCG and establish a new one, so that vote is going to happen next week across the practices in Shropshire and at the same time in Telford and Wrekin. We then have to submit our application through to NHS England by the end of September, and we at that point go through an assurance process. We've made clear to NHS England that at that point, at the end of September, we will not have answers to every single question they may wish to ask about the new organisation, because much of the work will continue after that date. But what we'll set out is the work we've done to date and the next steps we intend to take, and that will be the basis of our submission. Thereafter, all the next steps obviously are subject to both sign off by our membership and sign off by NHS England and improvement, and they will happen in the second half of the year. So they will include the finalisation of the operating plan, the finalisation of the constitution of the new CCG, the management structures, and all of the subcommittees and so on. So all of that will happen in the second half of the year. I will stop there and very happy to take questions.
Thank you. Before we go to the rest of the board, I have, as an exception and not as a sort of to set any future precedent, we'll let Mr. Gillard ask a follow-up question around that.
Yes, a follow-up question to my original question. And clearly, the regulations which I quoted in my question, are set by Parliament, not by NHS England. So even if the advice from NHS England was you do not need to have substantial patient involvement before making the application, that doesn't mean that legally there is still not an obligation because of the regulations. And my contention would be that those regulations require engagement or consultation, difficult to say which in terms of legal interpretation, but my legal advice would be consultation, before an application can be submitted, because you require the evidence to go in with that application. Now, the date you've got for the application is 27th of September. If I look at the communications and engagement paper, there are no dates set yet for engagement with patient representatives, and as a chair of the PPG, who was one of the listed people there, I've had no contact about that whatsoever at this stage. So the implication is you'll be making a submission without having engaged with patients as required under the statutory regulations, not the NHSE guidelines.
So
I
I reiterate...
ask you to take further legal advice. We have, and we don't want this to finish up in court, you know.
Indeed not. So we have taken legal advice, but I'm very happy to double check that. I should say we have done an element of patient engagement. I, for example, have been to the Shropshire patient group, and that's representative of the patient groups of every practice across Shropshire. We had a debate about it. They were supportive. So it's not that we've done nothing, but I reiterate, we have taken legal advice. I'm very happy to check it, and we are proceeding along on the basis of the legal advice we had, not simply advice from NHS England.
Thank you.
I can send you a fuller...
And we're cognizant of the fact we have taken legal advice and we can double check that advice, but obviously this process has been followed by quite a few number of CCGs, and within the explicit NHS England guidelines about what needs to be done, it says consultation isn't a necessity, but I understand what you say about the difference between NHS England and Parliament, and as I say, David said, we have taken legal advice and we'll just double check that internally. But thank you. Opening up to the board for questions. I think that was a fairly clear summary, I think, and obviously we have got the very detailed points beneath it that we're working to, which runs to several hundred.
And there are something like 80 key loans inquiry in the submission process that we are going through, which is why it's a challenge in terms of getting all the documentary evidence pulled together and so on. So we shouldn't underestimate that it's not a done deal. It's not a trivial matter for us simply to put an application in and all will be agreed. We are being properly and appropriately tested through this process to ensure there is confidence both of our membership but also of our regulators that we are proceeding with a sound and effective plan. I suppose the thing I didn't say is the plan, I've said it before in a board I believe, but the plan B, so what happens if we don't get approval at this point? Well, we will proceed to establish a single management team anyway, and that single management team and single staff team more generally will work across the two CCGs in that circumstance. We believe that's a suboptimal solution and would be a less effective way of achieving the same goals, but that's our alternative, and we will do that regardless.
Thank you. So, questions from the board? Happy with that, because we're asked to note the progress made to date and on creating a single CG commissioner and note the risks. An extra risk of which we've added is to double check our legal advice. So thank you. We move on to a paper with Sam, which is probably the first, or one of the steps in terms of aligning things between the CCGs, ultimately either to serve a single CCG or to serve two separate boards. Sorry?
You skip one, and it probably makes sense doing the order you've just suggested, but we'll come back to the strategic priorities.
It does. I
happy to do
thought it made sense to do that.
You're very wise.
Couldn't keep up with your...
My fleet of foot, quick thinking. Not only questions from the public, but also missing out papers. So that's fine. So yes, it does make sense though to do the creation of the remuneration committee in common. So Sam.
Yes, I mean, I'd like to think the paper is fairly self-explanatory, so I'll take it as read. But just to draw out the essence of it, following on neatly from David's run-through of the work towards becoming a single strategic commissioning organisation, this supports that direction of travel in taking a practical step to bring a key committee together. This committee will obviously have a key role in terms of the development around bringing together the executive team and the governing bodies into one, and it's likely that there'll be decision-making points in relation to that in the not too distant future. So this makes a move to bring that decision-making into one place across the two current organisations, so that happens in tandem. So the governing body is asked to support the move in that direction as described in the paper.
Thank you. Any questions? It's fairly self-explanatory. Meredith?
Thanks very much. Yes, very good idea. I just had a slight anxiety about time lag in terms of reporting to governing body. You know, we might just miss a critical window, and then there's a lengthy delay. So I just wanted to see if there was scope for putting in place a kind of a streamlining, I suppose, to ensure quick decisions are processed through the governing body processes.
I think one thing that has come out of this is obviously our terms of reference are out of line with other CCGs, and also out of line now with national. Previously we didn't feel they were out of line with national guidance, but now are out of line with the national guidance. So the idea of this is, without having to change our constitution in the short term, actually align them more so that decisions do come back to the board. So I think I can understand your concerns about the timeline, because of it's only bi-monthly board meetings, but I think that's something we probably have to work around with.
Yes, I think once the decision-making points become clearer and we're aware of how that fits with our governing body timetable, we can look at where we may need to streamline that and how we might do that.
Any further questions or points? I mean, it just might mean that we end up having a few more sort of emergency public meetings about if there are any quick decisions to be made.
Or indeed using the development sessions, we can formalise a section of those when we need to, so that gives us a monthly route rather than having to wait too much.
Sorry, talk about remuneration. What have you got in progress, in place now, that's taking the place of? Sorry, I'm being an idiot.
So we've both got separate remuneration committees that work in slightly different ways.
Right.
And the idea that if you're coming together with a single management team,
so there is a remuneration clinic already?
Yes.
Committee, all right.
And
that's
there's
all slight, no, I didn't realise there was one. But
and there are slight differences between the makeup of the committee, certainly around certain decisions, which are detailed in the paper. So the idea is to align them and be committees in common, as we note from the paper, and therefore allow sort of joint allow the discussion to take place once, and make it more likely that similar decisions will be reached for both CCGs.
Oh, that's cool. I just didn't know there was one. So I've learned something new every day.
You've not read your handbook.
Not read your handbook. You do have to have one, otherwise you do run into a bit of trouble.
What handbook? What's one of them?
So we're asked to approve the creation of a remuneration committees in common between NHS Shropshire CCG and NHS Telford and Wrekin CCG for the purpose of supporting the process and decision making associated with the transition to a single strategic commissioning organisation. So unless there's anyone who objects, I think we can say that you can agree with that.
Yeah.
Then we need to go backwards in the agenda to David talking about our strategic priorities.
Thank you, Chair. So you will remember, or you might not remember, back in, I think it was May, we received our operating plan, which was a long document with a good number of objectives set out in it, and that was our operating plan for the year. And in that discussion, we agreed that it would be helpful not to say we don't intend to implement the things that we set on our operating plan, but to extract from those the objectives we thought most important, and the rationale for doing that was to enable us to structure some of our board discussions around the issues we thought were of most significance to the organisation, and to bring back updates on progress in those areas. So that was the purpose of the work we then did in a development session for the governing body. And what came out of that were 6 priority areas, and within those areas 6 a commitment in each area for specific action against those priorities. This is the first time we've brought back a progress report, so I would be interested in have we got the level of detail right and so on. We didn't want to kill you with long detailed reports, and obviously the first one around the development of the single CCG, we are getting reports back anyway in more detail. So this doesn't substitute for that, but what it's intended to do is keep the board having sight of the progress we're making in the areas we said we wanted to ensure there was a focus on. So the brief paper sets out, reminds the board of the areas we said were priorities, remind the board of the action we committed to, and gives a brief update as of the date of writing where we have got to. It doesn't, and I should sort of fess up to this up front, we talked about developing some KPIs alongside the objectives. Now this hasn't done that yet, so I completely recognise that. There's a little bit of me that worries a bit about putting too much effort into this when we know we're working into a new organisation. So there's a kind of judgment call to be made on that, but again, happy to take your steer on what further work we need to do. So in short, this sets out, reminds you of the priorities that we agreed earlier in the year, sets out the progress we've made to date, and as I say, I'm interested both in happy to take questions or the relevant leads to take questions on any of the detail, but also any reflections on the approach we've taken in developing this particular report.
Thank you. Deborah?
Yeah, and you've kind of touched on what my question, the focus of my question. We formulated these as a CCG board, and I think we were all comfortable with the things that we'd identified. But I just wondered, as we're thinking more about forming the single organisation and also working more closely as a system, how do these align with the strategic priorities of the STP in the long-term plan and with Telford and Wrekin's priorities? I'm looking at them, and from the top of my head, having very, very briefly glimpsed the draft STP long-term plan priorities, they're similar but not quite the same. Should we be aligning them more closely, or are we happy to continue with things that don't quite match for the time being?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, they're in the same ballpark, but they're not worded identically. And I think you're right. Our strategic priorities, if they're not the same as the STP's priorities and the long-term plan priorities, and indeed connected to the Telford and Wrekin priorities, if we're moving to a single organisation, then we probably haven't got them quite right. And that's why I was saying these were struck at a particular moment in time for this CCG, and why I'm kind of suggesting it might not be worth finessing these to the nth degree if we should be putting our effort more into the more system-based work that we are already committed to. While not taking these away, I think we should continue reporting back progress for sure, because we said they were important to us. But our next version of this, our next iteration of this for next year should be derived from the long-term plan itself. I would have thought anyway.
Rachel?
I think it was just really to add on to that, because obviously, I recognise this priority. I think in terms of the long-term plan, you can see the alignment, and as we start to develop the JSNA and the first priorities and that, you can clearly see the alignment. I guess it's just an opportunity for us to make sure that the prevention and the early intervention public health work is woven through all of these, and I think and that moves us into the long-term plan. I know we're having those conversations, and I appreciate this is high level, but I think we could do some more work around that and kind of offer some support around, from a public health perspective, making sure that that's within reason. I know we've had conversations around cancer and other areas, but I think we could strengthen that.
And that would be appreciated. And again, today there's lots of different organisations and different boards with slightly different priorities, but all broadly the same, aren't they? So we do need some work to bring them together, but we'd welcome public health in the
whatever we can do within the capacity we've got, but I think it would help.
And it's a slightly separate point. With the JSNA work you're doing at the moment, we probably should bring back either to the board or certainly it'll come through the Health and Wellbeing Board, but I'd have thought some wider input to that, either at a development session or at the full board, would be well worth doing.
John?
Yeah, and I agree outside of that, just on the primary care side, and maybe it would link in with the sort of STP type challenges, are those of introducing, I think we had talked about having a more forward-looking estates policy to account for demographic changes within Shropshire and building, and I declare my interest of being in a practice within an area of development, but really talking as Shropshire as a whole, as grabbing that within a sort of an STP thought process, that we need to be planning ahead primary care for the changes of our population and to be able to serve that, because there seems to be a real disconnect at the moment of planning large housing developments without necessarily having the plans for primary care going alongside that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, Nikki, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but that's absolutely what we're trying to do through the long-term plan process, is connect the primary care strategy with the broader whole system strategy.
In terms of the estates plan, the Shropshire CCG primary care estates plan is in its final draft at the moment. It's going to primary care committee, hopefully, at the next meeting in October. Telford and Wrekin are undertaking the same process, but they're a couple of months behind us. And then the plan is by the end of the financial year, we will bring that together into a single plan that is then aligned completely with other community developments and the rest of the STP.
Which is easy to say and quite hard to do, but that the estate strategy of STP is the broad strategy. The primary care element should be absolutely connected, and the opportunities to work across boundaries should be explored where they're deliverable.
Thank you. Any further questions? I mean, I think it's been a good piece of work and an important piece of work. I think it's something that the executive team can use to build upon for establishing a new CCG as well, which is important.
And I think the process is important as the content. In some ways, it's about engagement. It's about this, what, as you know, as we've started to try and develop our commissioning intentions and so on, we're seeking to work in that way where we genuinely engage board members in that process. I think that's really important to make this an effective governance and get the best out of you as a board.
And the two things we're asked to note, one is to note the progress against the CCG or the development of the CCG strategic priorities, and the other one, as you said, is to know whether that the current reporting method is sufficient or whether we want to develop a set of KPIs. And I don't know if we want to particularly debate that point. I mean,
if people have, I mean, Alan, you were very keen that we were more succinct, I guess. Yes, less vague and a little bit more quantifiable on progress.
Greater discipline, really.
Yeah. And I think the principal's right. I guess I'm questioning, given what we've said, whether now is the time to push too hard on that. But we could have a first. It's not beyond the wit of man, or indeed woman, to have a go at this. Maybe just as a how easy or difficult is it to start to quantify measurable progress methodology, because that again could feed into the future CCG. So perhaps if we have a go and see what it looks like.
So anyone else with any views on that? Are we happy to let David go away and think about how we can develop some high-level sort of KPIs that add to the day job, really, that don't add another sort of thing that we need to be doing.
We don't want another layer of data collection. Wouldn't be great. So it would be derived from things we already know, but are meaningful, I think, is what Alan was proposing. I think it's right. That's the right approach, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. So we agree that then as a board. Yeah. Then move on to the next paper, which is the from the audit committee. This was unfortunately both Keith and Sarah are absent today. So in their absence, I suppose that I've read through the paper a number of times. And I think this one is fairly straightforward. So I will assume everyone's read it, and we can note the key issues on the front page, but then open it up for discussion to the board. I do have just one question about the arrangements for reviewing serious incidents. Is that meant, that's point 4 in the paper? Do we know whether that's about our proposal to have a review of serious incidents and the recognition and their management within the hospital? Is that an internal one for the CCG?
No, this was CW audited an internal audit of the CCG's SI processes.
So it's an internal one?
Yes.
That's fine. Are there any other questions with regard to your report from the audit committee? If not, then we'll note the content of the report and move on to Lynn and the Health Watch report.
Hello.
Hello.
I've just got a few minutes, so if I can take the report as read, but if there's any questions, what I can do is update you on the progress of the maternity mental health report. Health Watch England have published their national report that we fed into called Mental Health and the Journey to Parenthood, and it was published on the 9th of September, so we've contributed to that. Is there any questions?
Thank you. Any questions with regards? I mean, I welcome to, they're always very good reports to read and full of insightful information. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to perhaps ask a question about your report into the STP. I'm wondering what what are the headlines coming back from that report?
Yeah, so what I did for the SDP Comms and Engagement, I gave a very short presentation on our key findings, which I could bring here. Having spoken to Joe Harding, I'm encouraged that our findings are included in the SDP long-term plan report. The findings were particularly around people's views of engagement, how they were engaged with, and the outcomes of that engagement, because the report itself looks across quite a few conditions, and we did very detailed work into dementia and learning disability. So I'm now attending the Learning Disability and Autism Strategy group under the SDP, so we can feed into that directly. So there were lots of headlines across that. It was a lot of the feedback we got was about continuity, particularly of staff for people, but also for providers of services to ensure that they understood what other services were available for people so that they could share that information. But not only between services, but within organisations themselves, so that the staff knew fully what their own service could provide. So that was quite interesting for us.
Any further questions or comments? No, if not, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Then move on to a paper about the results of the Integrated Assurance Framework, which presents the two letters from NHS England. The first one that's presented is around the CCG's rating with regards to its patient and community engagement indicator, which is a positive one for the CCG because we were rated as green, so that's a very positive thing. I think we need to send that through to all our programme teams and our comms team to sort of say thank you very much for doing that, and it's obviously been reflected in the letter from NHS England. The other one was a slightly more challenging letter from NHS England, which is our annual assessment, which I do have some fundamental disagreements with. As the chair of the CCG, I've seen an improvement over the last few years. I feel we're a more coherent organisation. I feel we're working better internally and we're working better with our partners. So I was surprised to see that our rating last year, although it had gone up from inadequate to requires improvement, has gone back down to inadequate. And I think talking to anything that's primarily as a result of our finance, or one of the reasons is our finances, and our finances are in no worse position last year than they were the year before. So I think we've been affected possibly by a different set of people looking at the CCG and scoring the framework. So the message I'd like to send to our staff primarily is this isn't a true reflection, I think, of how the CCG is functioning. It's a reflection of the CCG's funding and the CCG's finance and the environment of the wider local economy that it works in. So I do agree with NHS England that our finances are a challenge, but I would disagree to say they're worse in the period of time this rating's about than the year before. So it's a positive message to staff, but a very negative message from NHS England, which, as I say, is not one that I can agree with. So I don't know if anyone else has got. There's obviously a bit of information about how that assessment's made, but I don't know if you want to open discussion from the board either about the patient engagement or about the actual IAF assessment. So, Sam.
I'd just like to reiterate your comments around the work that staff have done generally around developing public and patient participation, which we've been in the fortunate position to reflect in terms of the submission. I'd also particularly like to mention the input of Tracy Egby-Jones and Andrea Harper in pulling together the submission for this particular rating. It was a significant piece of work and required many hours of input to draw all that together. So I'd just like to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Meredith.
And may I just say, I completely agree with you, Julian, regarding the second issue. And that's it.
Thank you very much. No, if there's no further comments, then we will note the feedback we've had from NHS England and move on. We then follow a series of papers that are for information only, and if there are any questions about them, please ask them. There's the Clinical Commissioning Committee for the 19th of June, the Finance Performance Committees from July and August, Primary Care Commissioning Committee from June, Quality Committee in June and July, the A&E Delivery Board from June and July, and then locality meetings in the north in May, Shrewsbury in June, and the south locality in May as well. So those minutes are attached for information. I don't know if anyone has any questions that's arisen out of any of those papers. No. If not, then I've not been notified of any other business. The date of our next public meeting is Wednesday the 13th of November, and we'll confirm a time and venue in the near future. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for coming to our meeting today.
Thank you.